Everyone loves A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, right? I mean, who doesn't love this novella, which at least one critic has argued is the second most read book in English after the Bible? Hi, I'm Steve Bennett, and I'm one of the visiting scholars here at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, and the preamble that I'm about to share is presented by the John W. and Jean M. Rowe Inquiry and Exploration series, and we're very grateful to the Rowes for their support for this program. Thank you so much for spending the next half an hour with me, during which I hope to enhance your experience of the Q Brothers' Christmas Carol by situating their source material within the life and work of Charles Dickens, introducing you to the Q Brothers, and talking about some of the choices that they made for this particular production of the play. So let's get back to my question, who doesn't love A Christmas Carol? In order to answer that, I'm going to ask you to remember the morning after Scrooge has seen the ghosts. And this is one of the amazing things about this play. Everyone knows the story. It is so well known, as I will talk about and kind of repeat over and over. So remember that morning, Scrooge has seen the ghosts, he wakes up, he realizes he hasn't missed Christmas, he hasn't missed the holiday, looks out his window, there's a little lad in the street, he says, "Hey boy, go to the poulterer around the corner, get the prize turkey, not the little prize turkey, the big prize turkey," and Scrooge arranges for it to be delivered to Bob Cratchit's house. So in order to answer my question, who doesn't love A Christmas Carol? Let me turn to the book The Man Who Invented Christmas by Les Standiford, and he answers my question in this passage. Prior to this small moment at the end of Dickens' tale, the traditional bird for the well-provisioned table in England was the goose, and the impact of A Christmas Carol was said to have sent the nation's goose-raising industry to near ruin. So pretty much everybody loves this holiday classic except those in the English goose industry. And this is a group that I think has been unfairly overlooked. And so let's spend some time exploring why A Christmas Carol gripped the popular imagination with such force, and let's face it, that grip is still there, that it drove these goose producers to near ruin. And why did the Q Brothers want to join the thousands, and that's not hyperbole, the thousands of other writers and artists who have been inspired to create their own take on this now classic story? Why is A Christmas Carol so wildly popular? Well, a good place to start is with the author. Everyone knows Charles Dickens, incredibly prolific and influential writer. He, when he died at age 58 in 1870, he'd written many newspaper articles, stories, shorter works like A Christmas Carol, and had published 20 novels, not one of which has ever been out of print since the original publication. Most of his novels were serialized, published in monthly installments, and then all the installments would be collected, edited, reissued as a book. Publishing his novels in this serial way satisfied Dickens' desire to make the books accessible to as many people as possible, his very democratic desire to do that. Another way also increased sales. Almost everybody could afford the shilling that it cost to buy an issue of the magazine, or 12 cents in the States. And Dickens learned that he could significantly boost sales by adding a cliffhanger at the end of each installment. Obviously, he didn't pioneer that, but he perfected it in a way that every TV writer in Hollywood is grateful for. Dickens was incredibly popular in the US as well as the UK, and there are these great stories about how Dickens' most avid readers would gather at the dock waiting for the ships coming from England with the latest serialization. And he wrote a novel that was serialized called The Old Curiosity Shop. And there was a crowd there waiting for the boat to come in. And when the boat was within earshot, they shouted, "Is little Nell still alive?" hoping that the sailors who, if they could read, had read it, could give them that very important information. So the roughly 80-page A Christmas Carol was, of course, not a serialization. He wrote it over 6 weeks in October and November of 1843. The novel that he was writing at this time in installments was Martin Chuzzlewit, and in certain ways, his shorter Christmas book is a vivid distillation of the themes of this larger work, which in this time, October, November 1843, was on installments 11 and 12 of 20, so Martin Chuzzlewit was halfway through. In her excellent biography of Dickens, Jane Smiley argues that, quote, A Christmas Carol, like Martin Chuzzlewit, concerns itself with the social ramifications of selfishness. She points out that the characters of young and old Martin Chuzzlewit are combined in Scrooge, and that, quote, his moral journey, which takes place in 3 acts in one night, has the force of revelation rather than the tedium of a lengthy trek by ox-drawn wagon, unquote. And I mean, that's a pretty good description of the experience of modern readers for some of Dickens' lesser-known work, a lengthy trek by ox-drawn wagon. In one of the many insightful and funny ways that the Q brothers weave Dickensian details into their remix, Chuzzlewit is in the name of a character in the Q version. He's one of Scrooge's lifelong friends. Scrooge's other lifelong friend is named Pip, and Pip is, of course, the narrator and protagonist of the novel Great Expectations. Martha Cratchit is a character in the original and in the Q brothers version. And here she has a full ride scholarship at Nickleby State University, which is identified as Scrooge's alma mater, where she is a straight-A student. And of course, Nicholas Nickleby is the protagonist of Dickens' third novel, The Life and Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby. A Christmas Carol is one of 5 books that Dickens published at Christmas time. But unless you're a real Dickens fan, you probably haven't heard of or read The Chimes, The Hearth, The Battle of Life, or The Haunted Man. When A Christmas Carol was published, it was wildly popular from the very beginning. The initial print was 6,000 copies. That sold out almost immediately. Many more were printed right then. The next book, the next Christmas, was The Chimes. And based on the success of A Christmas Carol, at that time, The Chimes sold even more initially. But of course, since then, A Christmas Carol has become the best known book of this genre from Dickens, and really the best known of all of Dickens's books. And there are many explanations for why A Christmas Carol is so popular. The story itself has such a simple and straightforward structure that anyone, even children, can follow it. I've read articles where theater producers call A Christmas Carol a gateway drug for theater, and talk about how parents love bringing their young children to the many, many annual productions of the play all over the English-speaking world. And even if you're so young that you're encountering the story for the first time on the page or at a theater, Scrooge's initial miserliness, the ghosts, the sick child, they're all so readily available to every audience that nearly everyone comes away from the theater having experienced that instructive and cathartic lesson of Scrooge's transformation. Another reason for its popularity has to be the Christmas connection. The story taps into and distills what many would argue is or should be a central message of Christmas, real concern for your fellow beings, and a genuine generosity of spirit. Audiences can experience their own Scrooge-like transformation as the play asks them to consider who they have overlooked and how they can remedy those wrongs. And you think about if Charles Dickens had written what is basically a ghost story about a miser who turns over a new leaf. If it hadn't been tied in with Christmas, would it have that staying power? Because it is a Christmas story and it was so popular, it's become a part of the Christmas celebrations for so many families, and it kind of taps into that Christmas mythology in a way that every year as Christmas rolls around earlier and earlier, and you see the Christmas decorations going in the stores, Santa is coming, Scrooge and Tiny Tim and the rest of the Cratchits are coming. And if this hadn't been a Christmas book, just a Dickens ghost story, I don't think it would be as popular as it is now. Let's transition now to the Q Brothers and their adaptation. The Q Brothers are a Chicago theater troupe that was started by founder and creative director GQ and his co-founder and musical director JQ. And I suggest looking in the program or on the Q Brothers' excellent website to see each of the 5 members' extensive biographies. The main thrust of their work over the last 20 years has been reinterpreting Shakespeare basically through hip hop with great success. New York Times critic Christopher Isherwood called their Othello the Remix a clever and exuberantly performed hip-hop version of the play, which is also, I think, a great description of their take on A Christmas Carol. Now, in the script of the show, there is a section at the very beginning entitled Author's Notes, with author's notes, as the name clearly states, on various aspects of the play. And I want to read just one paragraph of that section because I think it sums up what they're doing much better than I can. We, Q Brothers Collective, are a multi-ethnic and racially diverse team interested in exploring satire and clowning through rhyming musical theater. We understand that there are different levels of comfort when using humor alongside serious issues such as racism, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, and ethnic background. Please approach these characters as we originally wrote and performed them with laughter and joy. This is a play about inclusion, respect, togetherness, and love. So the Q Brothers Christmas Carol was brought to the Chicago Shakespeare Theater by Rick Boynton, who had worked with them on 2 previous adaptations, one of Much Ado About Nothing, the other on Othello, the remix, which I mentioned. And Rick Boynton and the Q Brothers took Othello the Remix to London for a sold-out run during the 2012 Cultural Olympiad that was accompanied the Olympic Games there, and then on to New York, where John Leguizamo was also involved in that production. A central feature of what the Q Brothers do when they reinterpret a classical work, whether it's Shakespeare or, in this case, A Christmas Carol, is they tell the story in rhythm and rhyme. The rhythm of this production propels it forward at a rapid pace, and the aural pleasures and cleverness of the rhymes add a whole new level of enjoyment to the story. And think about the way rhyme works. So if you're reading a poem or you're listening to a song or you're at the theater and you know that the work that you're watching or reading or listening to rhymes, you develop an expectation. You know that a rhyme is coming, and when it works, when that rhyme comes, it is simultaneously surprising and inevitable. There's a kind of paradox that makes rhyme magical in that way. You know it's going to rhyme, but you don't know what the rhyme will be, and then when it comes, it satisfies you and surprises you. And the Q Brothers are masters at this. And let me just give you two quick examples. So very early in the play, we're at, of course, the offices of Scrooge and Marley. And Scrooge, to save money, keeps it cold in there. Bob Cratchit, his employee, is doing his best to work in those icy conditions. And at one point, he can't take it, so he heads to the thermostat, and Scrooge says, "No turning that." Bob says, "Sorry, sir, it was just 2 degrees," to which Scrooge replies, "You can freeze." The degrees and freeze rhyme is funny, and it also drives home what is happening in a playful way that you wouldn't get in prose. And there's so many examples of this in the play. Let me just give you one more. So while on his trip with the ghost of Christmas Past, Scrooge will be taken back to his old job at Fezziwig's, where he was an apprentice. And at Fezziwig's, in the Q version, he dates this character, Belle. Both young Scrooge and Belle love, love, love math, which is what brought them together. And at one point, they're explaining to a third character how they met under the mistletoe. Young Scrooge says, "I looked into her eyes and saw a fraction of my soul," to which Belle replies, "I looked back into his, and that fraction became whole." So that delicious multi-level wordplay of soul and whole is an example of the way these pleasures of rhyme are woven throughout the story, and they reinforce the meaning but also make it so much more fun to listen to. The Q brothers' adaptation of their source material works in this same way as the rhyme does. So it's both surprising and inevitable. Everyone knows A Christmas Carol. So you come to the theater, you're expecting to see Marley's ghost. You're expecting to see the ghosts of Christmas past and present and future. And the way that they're delivered within the Q brothers version, they achieve that paradox of being both surprising and within the story of the play, inevitable. And so it's fantastic how this works on both a micro and a macro level. In Paul Davis's book, The Lives and Times of Ebenezer Scrooge, Davis describes how A Christmas Carol has been, quote, adapted, revised, condensed, added to, and modernized more than any other work in English literature. And he says the reason that is the case is because in all of the historical periods since the work was first published in 1843, each period is able to look into that book and see itself reflected in a unique way. So the parodies, piracies, and retelling of the story in each of the periods speak to the specifics of that historical moment. Take, for example, quote, the Scrooge of the 1960s became a Freudian figure tormented by his past, who conjured up Marley as a way of calling for help, and who turned on to Christmas and turned into joys he had denied himself. Now, Davis's book was published in 1990. Had it been published later, I'm sure that the Q brothers' Christmas Carol would have been included, or should have been. It fits perfectly into Davis's thesis. This version of the story, which is now in its 9th year at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, is very much of our historical moment. It's a hip-hop musical, and hip-hop is obviously a dominant, if not the dominant, musical and cultural genre of our time. And I mentioned earlier how it explores very current issues such as racism, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation. Another way this production is very much of our time, very postmodern, is how the 5 cast members play all 32 characters. And rather than changing costumes off stage, which is what would happen in a more traditional play, the transitions from character to character are not hidden at all. The transitions almost become a character of their own in the story. The production showcases how it is doing what it is doing, rather than trying to hide it so that you can concentrate on the fictional world itself. So it goes kind of meta, if you know what I mean. The main way the different characters are identified is by their wigs, which is an allusion to Fezziwig, the anti-Scrooge, the good and generous capitalist who hired and taught young Scrooge right after college in the Q version, as an apprentice in the Dickens version. And it's also an allusion to the exploitative wig-making practices that will lead to Marley's punishment. At several points in the play, the wigs themselves become characters, further emphasizing the way that hair is woven into the plot. The Q Brothers' Christmas Carol is very postmodern in the way that it collapses any and all distinctions between high and low culture, as the collective takes this story, which is very much part of a traditional literary canon, and weaves in an astonishing variety of allusions and cultural references, from TV ads for the Hair Club for Men to a recreation of a famous scene from the 1983 film A Christmas Story, to Bob Marley, and many, many, many others. The Bob Marley, Jacob Marley connection is one that we should explore for a minute. At first, it almost seems like a simple pun. Jacob and Bob share a last name, and you wonder when you first meet Jacob Marley's character if that is connection enough for the collection to just run with it. And then there's a sort of short explosion of reggae beats and choreography and costume. But as the retelling proceeds, you'll learn that the connection goes far beyond Jacob and Bob serendipitously having the same last name. And I don't want to give too much away, but in the scene at Fezziwigs, you'll learn why Jacob Marley has been transformed into a Jamaican as a punishment for his sins. Let's spend a minute talking about Tiny Tim, portrayed here by JQ as Lil Tim. The original character of Tiny Tim was based on or inspired by Dickens's sickly younger brother, whom he called Tiny Fred. Tiny Tim, or Lil Tim's illness, has been this subject of speculation in various medical journals. And my personal favorite is from a publication called the Journal of the American Medical Association, Pediatrics, in which Donald Lewis, MD, wonders, is it possible to construct a differential diagnosis for Tim's short stature, asymmetric crippling disorder, and curious intermittent weakness that would lead to his death, if untreated, within a period of 1 year? The important thing about Tiny Tim, or Lil Tim, is of course not his specific medical condition, but the fact that he is the sentimental heart of the story and always has been. And critics who've written about A Christmas Carol have noted that A Christmas Story is about the baby Jesus. And in A Christmas Carol, Tiny Tim kind of displaces the baby Jesus as the young innocent at the center of the story. The problem with Tiny Tim, or Lil Tim, in 2021 is that the sentimentality surrounding him has become so familiar, so tired, that it is almost impossible to take this kind of maudlin Victorian sentimentality seriously at this very late date in the history of the play. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but I invite you to pay careful attention to how the Q brothers use all of their tools. Lil Tim's own dialogue, his interests, the way his character is developed, the music surrounding him, the choreography, especially in this case, a specific prop, the way they use all these things to explode that sentimentality and give us a Lil Tim that we can't help but sincerely cheer for. So, in closing, while the English goose industry do not like A Christmas Carol, this adaptation by the Q brothers is so playful, so joyful, has such a Tiny Tim that we can cheer for, that even goose farmers may find it hard to resist. Thank you.